May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Just about 3 years ago, I was traveling across the country with my friend and colleague Daniel. And we were driving from Toledo, Ohio to Anaheim. And it was just almost to the end of the last General Convention in Anaheim. And we were preparing to ride our bicycles back across the country from the Anaheim Convention Center to the Episcopal Church Center in New York City. And I was driving, and we were somewhere in Kansas, which seems to be the theme of my life over the last number of years, always somewhere in Kansas. And Daniel had pulled out the box of maps that I had collected for us to get from Anaheim to New York City. And I had some really nice bicycle maps. And for better or for worse, these bicycle maps also had elevation curves on them. And Daniel had unfortunately pulled out the map that showed Colorado. And he said to me, "Have you looked at this thing?" I said, "Well, not real closely, Daniel, but yeah, I've looked over all the maps." He said, "Do you know there are mountains between Anaheim and New York?" I said, "Yes, Daniel, I did know that there were mountains. In fact, there's more than one set of mountains." He said, "Do you see Monarch Pass?" I said, "Well, no, but do you want to tell me about Monarch Pass?" He says, "Monarch Pass is more than 11,300 feet high. And we're supposed to ride our bicycles over that." And as we looked more at the map, we discovered that the approach to Monarch Pass means that the bicyclist had to travel 1 mile of elevation in 10 miles of distance. If you've done much bicycling, that is a significant elevation for that amount of room on the road. And so Daniel brooded about Monarch Pass for days. We finally got over the Rocky Mountains to Anaheim, and the first thing he said to Mark Hollingsworth, our bishop, when we got there is, "Do you know we have to go over Monarch Pass, and it's this high, and I don't know how we're going to do this." Daniel was a bit of a worrier. So what we decided was 4 bicyclists were going to get in the bishop's Prius with their bicycles on the car, and they were each going to ride 2.5 miles of the 10 miles needed to reach the top of the pass. And we had one young man with us, Carl. He had just graduated high school. He was 18 years old. He wanted to ride up the whole thing himself. But the bishop told him that he had to be part of the team and that he could actually take the last leg and be the one that actually got our sorry group up to the top of the pass. And so they started, and the bishop took the first leg. He was being a good sport, rode 2.5 miles, and they switched off and switched off. And of course, Carl gets on the road with 2.5 miles to the top and takes off like a jackrabbit. Just flew up the pass. Put all the rest of the guys to shame as they had been slogging up the mountain. And we all met at the top of the pass and took our picture at the top. There's a really nice visitor center up there. And we had seen bicyclists coming up and going down, and coming up and going down. The lesson that we learned from that particular part of the trip was that no one of us was going to manage to get from Anaheim to New York by ourselves. But that when we worked together, we discovered that we could conquer just about anything. And indeed, Monarch Pass was not the last mountain we went up or went down, even if it was the tallest. This image of mountains that we celebrate today on Mountain Sunday has long and rich traditions, both in our Christian history and in our secular history. If you remember back through the Bible, I think the first time we actually get an idea about mountains is when Noah and the ark get set down on top of a mountain as the waters recede. And God makes a covenant with humanity that He will never again destroy the world with water. And if you continue to read the Old Testament, Moses goes up on the mountain to meet God. And in meeting God, he comes down with the 10 Commandments. Moses again goes up on the mountain and meets God again. And when he comes back down, his face is so radiant, so bright, that no one can stand to look on him. And Moses wears a cloth over his face so that people can stand to look upon him, because in seeing the face of God, Moses himself shone with a bright light. We continue on, we read about the prophet Elijah, who in the midst of speaking truth to power angered the king and flees to the mountain to hide because the king wants to kill him. And God invites Elijah to step outside to encounter God. And a terrible wind comes by, but God's not in the wind. And then there's an earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. And then there is sheer silence, and God is found in that silence. And in one of my favorite Bible stories, Jesus goes up the mountain with Peter and James and John and Andrew for the transfiguration, and he is transfigured before them. Our Christian literary history is rich with this image of mountains, and often God is found on the mountain because people believe that the higher you got, the closer you got to God. You were closer to the heavens. And so people would climb the mountains, trying to get closer and closer and closer to God. We also find this image of mountains in other places. If you've ever read or listened to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, he talks about freedom ringing, and he speaks about freedom ringing from the mountains. That is, from the top of mountains, that voices will be heard. We're familiar with the story of Sisyphus, who rolls the rock up, and the rock rolls back down the mountain. Mountains are familiar to us, and they flow through our imagery, both sacred and secular. Each of us lives with mountains. Each of us encounters mountains. They might be the real mountains as you're driving east from here, but each of us in our lives has mountains that we climb. It might be a time of illness, might be a time of job loss or uncertainty. There might be issues in family or school or work. We might have experienced the death of a loved one. And we feel that we are climbing this mountain, climbing and climbing and climbing. And what's so hard about climbing the mountain is that often all you can see is the path directly in front of you. You can't see the forest for the trees. All you can see is one foot, and the next foot, and the next foot. But what we know in our Christian life is that as we are climbing those mountains, we're not doing it by ourselves. We are doing it in the company of family and friends who believe in us. We are doing it in the company of our Christian community. We're not left out there on our own. You've probably seen pictures or images of mountain climbers roped together so that if one falls, the rest are there to catch the one who's fallen. We believe in our Christian life that God is always walking up those mountains with us. Sometimes ahead, showing us the way, inviting us forward, showing us the possibilities. Sometime behind, giving us that extra push when we just think we can't take one more step. And then we reach the top. And in reaching the top, we see. We see what's ahead. We see where we've come from. We see